From Sage International, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John Bruni. John, how are you?
Not too bad, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm fine. I am really fine. Plenty to talk to you about. What did you think of Penny Wong's statement? It was almost, at arm's length from government. I don't know if it was a personal statement or desire to endorse statehood for Palestine.
I would say that the Labour Party is a broad church with a number of different and differing opinions.
Yeah.
I suppose the pro-Palestinian left-leaning element of the ALP does have a champion in Penny Wong. The problem, of course, is that whatever she said is not really guaranteed to create any form of Australian policy. I mean, I suppose, to be generous to her statement, she gave a signal of the Albanese government's displeasure with the state of affairs. And look, there is certainly something to be said for the way the IDF has conducted its operation against Hamas, because, they haven't been quite as discriminating with regard to keeping civilians out of the firing line, shall we say. But nonetheless, Australia is not known to provide deep and profound policy settings on the international stage. We normally let that sort of thing happen in the corridors of power in London or certainly in Washington, D.C., but Canberra never initiates deep and profound international affairs policy at that level.
Yeah, well, it would seem sensible to sort of know know the things that you can influence and know the things that you can't influence, and be wise enough to be able to recognise them. But what's she doing then? She's just playing to the left of the party.
Well, there is a domestic element here which people tend to forget, and that is that we do have a very vibrant Palestinian and pro-Palestinian a set of communities in and around Australia. And of course, any person in politics, will be playing the multicultural card and will be trying to appeal to the sensibility of local Palestinian and or pro-Palestinian elements in order to shore up Labor Party support in various seats. Now, I don't want to sound cynical about this, but this is Australia. This is modern Australia, and this is how modern Australian politics is conducted. And whether it be with the Liberal Party or the Labor Party, they both play the same game.
Well, they'd better have an eye on the various electorates and what is going to get up their nose and what's going to please them. I would think there are probably, particularly around Western Sydney, there would be 4 seats, Labor Party seats, that they would not want to lose, and they are very Islamic or Middle Eastern seats.
Yes.
Yeah, so, I can understand that. Yes. So in other words, she's not going to do any harm. She's just playing politics.
Well, that's true. But, I mean, in terms of doing harm, I mean, it depends on what side of the fence you come from on this conflict. I mean, if you happen to be part of the Jewish community in Melbourne, you may take offence to what Penny Wong had put forward as being pro-Hamas, which apparently has been doing the rounds as well. Now, just because you're against the Gaza war in terms of the civilian or the level of civilian casualties, that does not mean that you are pro-Hamas. But those kind of nuanced points have been lost in this conflict because both sides have mobilized their PR machines, that is the pro-Palestinian side as well as the pro-Israeli side, and both sides are actually fighting an information war as well as a war on the ground in Gaza.
Why would it be that with so many Arab countries in that neck of the woods that there wouldn't be countries that could put their hand up and take the entire 1.3 million people who are at the moment in harm's way? Why not?
Well, it's a complicated question, so give me a couple of seconds and I'll try to unpack this. What people need to understand, Jeremy, is that Palestinians are Arabs, but Palestinians among Arabs are a different nationality. They're a different brand of Arab. Not all Arab states sympathize to the same degree with Palestine. And when I say Arab states, I'm talking about Arab governments. The people, the Arab street, they may support, a very vocalized element of the Palestinian movement, but the governments themselves consider the Palestinians a threat. I'll give you an example. The Egyptian government, you would kind of think to yourself, well, Gaza is right next door to Egypt. Why don't the Egyptians just let the Palestinians cross over the Rafah border and into Sinai? They'll be safe. No, they won't. The government of General El-Sisi is very much against Hamas and anything that smacks of Hamas. The reason why is that they had their own failed experiment with electing a Muslim fundamentalist government into power a few years back. That was directly related to something called the Muslim Brotherhood, the same sort of ideology that pervades Hamas. So they see Hamas and people sympathetic to Hamas as the enemy and an existential threat because they don't want to have a repeat performance in Cairo. And you have to understand that that's about... Let me see if I get my facts correct. Around about the 100 million Egyptians, following a Muslim fundamentalist authority on the same ideological scale of Hamas, which would tip the balance of power completely in the Middle East and arguably against Israel, which really is no one's interest. Okay, so just because you're a Palestinian and you're an Arab doesn't necessarily mean that you can just cross over borders and find yourself a new home. I mean, another example would be Jordan, which is on the West Bank side of things. Now, there are many millions of Palestinians inside Jordan, and for many years, because of the highly politicized nature of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, it's caused a lot of ructions within Jordan. They've seemed to have managed those ructions rather well, but look, it would take one awful incident or some other terrible thing that we can't see or foretell right now to set the whole bloody place ablaze. And this is the thing that people have to understand. It's not as simple as we make out, or maybe the media makes out, because they kind of miss all the nuanced aspects of the conflict. Yeah.
I don't know whether it's rent a crowd or they're, sincere and motivated people, but there are demonstrations planned for Melbourne, I think, around Lockheed Martin. They don't want Australia or Australian companies supplying any arms or ammunition to Israel. So they're sort of getting in the way with the average Australian, and dragging us to a degree into the argument.
Well, again, we made this compact back in the late 1980s where we wanted to have a multicultural Australia, which means that, we have to then be sympathetic to the plight of minority groups that have just freshly arrived in Australia. Those arguments are not our arguments as a nation state, but we made that compact through multiculturalism to say, yes, they are our arguments, and our political elite must have opinions on conflicts that they either don't want to get involved with or do not understand. And the Australian people generally don't want to get involved with at all. I mean, it doesn't affect Australia directly. It affects minority groups that come from, certain countries overseas, but that does not necessarily mean we ought to get ourselves involved in these conflicts, just like the United States. How many times have we talked about, oh my God, what are they doing in Iraq? They have no clue. I mean, you've got some smart people in the Pentagon. Have they picked up a history book over the last, 2 decades? Arguably not. And that is because these conflicts are so deeply rooted, and very few people have the patience necessary to find the nuanced point, understand the local arguments and conflicts, and come in with with a full understanding. So we go in there with our media headlines screaming, saying we must do this, we must do that, overly simplifying everything, and then screwing everything up as a consequence.
What can you tell me about Mark Binskin? He's a general, isn't he?
Yeah, Air Marshal.
Air Marshal.
Yeah. So former Air Force, RAAF. Look, he's a highly competent person.
He's going to what? Sort of be a liaison or a resident expert for the government on this whole Middle Eastern thing? I wonder what's behind such an appointment.
Look, I don't want to be cynical about this, but I can't help myself.
Do it.
It's a job for a boy looking for a job,
I didn't think of that.
See, if you happen to be a retired air marshal with nothing much to do, and the government approaches you and say, how would you like to get paid in your retirement to do something that we know that you won't really be very effective in doing, even though you're an effective operator.
Yeah.
Well, how about this? It's free. It's money for jam, effectively, and it gives him a sense of prestige in the role post his role in the Air Force. Now, some people will say, well, there's nothing wrong with that, John, because, he's part of the political military elite. And these people, even though they retire from their official gig, are still clued up enough that they can engage the world. And there is a strong argument to say that. But then we're talking about Australia. We're not talking about the United States. We're not talking about a country that moves and shakes internationally. So what will Binskin actually bring to the role? Not a great deal, I would imagine.
But wouldn't we have ambassadors and diplomats and people on the ground anyway? I mean, appointing a military person to be the conduit and have the ear of government on this particular business, does that send the right message?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head and answered your own question, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I don't think it necessarily sends the right message. Look, he's a military guy. And as a military guy, that would mean that, the companies like Lockheed Martin and all those other companies that now people are protesting against or are going to be protesting against, he was front and center of bringing all that stuff to Australia to help defend Australia. And in a post-military retirement, these people normally get siphoned off by defense industry. So again, I'm not so sure just how genuine his capacities will be in order to make things right for Australia. And you're absolutely right. We've got highly paid diplomatic staff in DFAT that ought to be front and center. I will ask the question, where are they?
Yeah. We've had
I mean, that's a question for Penny Wong, quite frankly. So hopefully you interview her at some point.
I don't think she speaks to me. The big shake-up with all the top brass in defence. Admiral, he is an admiral, a vice admiral, or a rear admiral?
Admiral David
Johnston. He's a relative of mine.
Oh, is he? Wow.
And interestingly, he is also a descendant of Lieutenant Colonel George Johnston, who was the first man back in 1788 to set foot on Australian soil.
Wow, that's a lineage.
Well, actually, he wasn't the first man to put his foot on the soil, because the convict who carried the colonel ashore claims he was the first man to put his foot on Australian soil, and he was right.
Yeah, well, that may be true, but he was a convict, so we can forget
that. Well, I think old Colonel George was a colourful character, as they all were back in those days. But anyway, so he is an admiral, and the shake-up with the top brass was brought on by what? What do you think they're trying to achieve?
Well, it was interesting in the immediate aftermath of the change. I mean, there's always a limit by which how many years a chief of the Defence Force will serve. But there have been some people who are very highly critical of Angus Houston, Angus Campbell, I should say, and the way that he, kind of didn't really do what people were expecting of him, especially under Morrison. And we had the whole Brereton report, and he kind of just covered stuff up rather than sort of revealed, the hand of the Australian military in Afghanistan in the way that some people were thinking that the investigation should have. There were also people suggesting that it was not effective enough in keeping the level of defence expenditure in the country high, and when I say high, I mean at a level like around about the 2.4% of GDP, which is really the golden mean for Australia.
Yeah.
A lot of money has been going into defence under his watch, but we haven't really seen an expansion of the force structure. Where are the new recruits? We're still having ghost units in the Australian military, meaning, units that are on paper, but they're not manned. We're having a really bad situation in terms of recruiting and retaining personnel in Australia. No one's joining the military. The way that they do their adverts, anyone would think that it would be like a Sunday school camp. There's no sense of what is the military there for, except for filling, minority quotas and looking as if it's fun. Now, I mean, I wore the uniform as a reservist, and I was, at one point in my career thinking very seriously about going regular. But the fact of the matter is, when I was going through, the recruitment was all about the sacrifice. It was all about the history, the Anzacs, that sort of that lineage of the things that made this country great based on the back of the sacrifices of the diggers of old, and there was all that sort of war-y culture that we kind of celebrated, but we don't do that anymore. So now, you got all these kind of, I don't know, I hate to say it, woke people who are in charge of recruiting and retaining people. I don't know who they're retaining because people are leaving in droves, which means who's actually manning the pitchfork that's meant to be guarding north of Australia? I don't know.
Well, it's still costing us. I think it's $50 billion a year. That's the sort of ballpark for the budget for running the military. It's an awful lot of money. I don't see. As you say, I don't see very much return for that.
No, there is no return on investment for the amount of money being put into the ADF at the moment. Some people may say that my criticism is too harsh and perhaps we just need another decade or two. But, we're living in a world now where threat perception can happen at an instant, for many, many decades, actually, since World War II. The idea of a threat to Australia, we'd had plenty of time to sort that threat out, Jeremy. We got 10 years before the Missourians, come with their warships into the Arafura Sea. Don't worry about it, So, with that sort of he'll be right mentality, we've been running our defence forces into the ground, quite frankly. And now we're, we are in the middle of a new age of high-intensity warfare in Europe, in the Middle East, and maybe in not so distant time in the future, we're going to have it in Asia on our doorstep. And what are we doing? We're sleeping at the wheel.
Yeah, well, you would imagine, wouldn't you, that the government would have a considerable interest in watching the west coast of Australia. This is the third boat in 5 months. They've now got 64 people on Nauru. But
there's so much you can do, though. Jeremy, honestly, I agree with you 100%. But with the manning levels that we currently have in the Navy, we will never have enough fully crewed vessels doing what they ought to be doing, and that is supporting Operation Sovereign Borders, and also making sure that we can fulfill our alliance commitments with the United States. That's the sad fact.
Yeah, well, clearly when the word gets around that it's not a question of a leaky old fishing boat bringing these people to Australia, they're probably completely different, more modern boats because they can get in, they can drop people off, and they can leave undetected. Now, once the word gets out that it's basically the gates are open, I think 3 boats in 5 months will be nothing to what we'll see.
And see, the other thing that I have to raise, and it's an uncomfortable issue because I know that the people who serve today are not the same sort of people that served 50 years ago. And the fact is that there are people who come in and get easily traumatized by the job they're meant to be doing. Now, because of all these nice fluffy recruitment ads where it looks like a Sunday picnic and, you're not having to do anything particularly difficult or hard, when they are then called upon to do the hard thing, there's this issue with regard to post-traumatic stress disorder that comes out. We've got high rates of suicide, both here, the United States, the United Kingdom, and it makes you wonder. We used to fight world wars, Jeremy, world wars with carnage that we can't even imagine. Not even the old black and white newsreels brings that home. But I remember my grandfather told me stories about his service, and it was not a Hollywood prop. It was awful. And yet they had to live with the effect of fighting after the war, and there was no mental health treatment center. There was no
No.
care about suicide. People just had to suck it up and move on. But now we are in a different age where everyone that has a particular sensitivity to something becomes so great that it makes you wonder what sort of recruits go into the defense forces. Because, going back to the whole Operation Sovereign Borders, I heard stories, and I'm sure that you did too, of the initial bunch of naval people and crews going up there to intercept refugees that were deeply traumatized by their job. It's like, oh my God, I've got all these families. I'm so traumatized, I don't know what to do with myself. I've got PTSD,
I know.
and they go on pension.
It's bizarre.
It's like, well, I don't understand it.
Stress leave. Stress leave from doing the job.
Yeah.
The two pillars that they keep on talking about, there's AUKUS, which we all know about. There's a bit of talk and media static about, but not too much action is happening. But now they're talking about a new alliance with Japan. Now, is that Australia, Japan, America? Is England involved in that one?
No. Well, actually, yes and no. I mean, and when we say alliance, we have to be very careful. I would say that AUKUS is more of a security compact rather than an alliance.
Yeah, that's the first pillar. But now they're talking about the second pillar.
Well, yes, there are two pillars in AUKUS, but they don't necessarily involve Japan in any other way other than if we can cooperate with them, we will, on an as-need basis. But they're not going to be formalized as what the screaming headlines had put forward, that there is now a JAUKUS, which is Japan, Australia, the US, and the UK. We're not going through we're not going through that. The Pillar 1 is the submarine building aspect of AUKUS. Pillar 2 is looking at sharing technologies, critical technologies like quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, cyber, and all these, deeply new age elements of national security, new technology, AI, machine learning, all of that kind of thing, space, that also falls into the purview. So, and really Pillar 2 is about cooperation between the three principal AUKUS members. That's Australia, the UK, and the US. There is now talk that Japan will be on the sidelines, sort of. They're not going to be officially part of AUKUS, so the notion of a formalized JAUKUS is completely a fabrication of the media. But what will happen is that by bringing Japan in on an as-need basis, we can also leverage off some of the technologies that they are bringing to the table. Now, your listeners may not know, but the Japanese and the British, as well as the Italians, actually, are building a tri-national sixth-generation fighter plane. Now, of course, when that comes to fruition, there is going to be interest by both Tokyo and London to sell these planes elsewhere at a profit. And, I mean, I hope we buy some because they look pretty good by the initial indications. But for that to happen, Britain and Japan will need to share certain strategic technologies, especially in that sort of AUKUS space. If we're talking about AI, how much AI will be shared between the UK and Japan? How much will the Americans allow the UK and Japan to play in that space? Because a lot of the IP that America owns and on-sells to third countries can't then be used by those third countries to then on-sell to fourth countries, for instance.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of legal implications with this. So again, the Americans still play, they're always going to be the elephant in the room. They will let other minor countries do what they want to do up to a point, but not beyond that point.
Wonderful to talk to you, John. Thank you very much for your wonderful knowledge and background.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Much appreciated. Dr. John, by the way, John.
Yes?
Have you got a podcast or other ways people can hear you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We have a podcast that is called The Focus, and it is on YouTube. It is also on the Sage International website, www.sageinternational.com.au.
Uh-huh. How often do you put in a new episode?
Well, I have to say, I've taken a brief few-week reprieve from recording because I'm currently shifting abode. But generally, once a fortnight, we'll start recording again, probably as of next week.
Must viewing, must listening. Thanks a lot, John.
No worries, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Dr. John Bruni.